So the primary purpose of brain-machine interface is as a therapeutic application to help restore movements to immobilized patients. In my talk, I'm going to describe how we're trying additionally to use the BMI as an experimental tool to probe the classic questions of motor cortex function. This work was done in collaboration with Levi Spiegelman, another student in the laboratory who has since finished his PhD. In it, he worked on algorithms for decoding movement from neural activity. So what is BMI? In our BMI setup, macaque fascicularis monkeys sit in primate chairs facing a screen. And each monkey had a chronic 96 microelectrode array implanted in the arm region of primary motor cortex. Here you can see a picture from the surgery. This is the array sitting on the brain. This is the pneumatic inserter. And this is the central sulcus. From these arrays, we extract single and multi-unit activity. Here you can see a very large, well-isolated unit in blue. The peak-to-peak is more than 1 millivolt. Another unit in green, and a multi-unit activity in yellow. These are the waveforms from one electrode. And here you can see a population raster plot showing the activity on the entire array as a function of time. These signals are fed in real time into our algorithm, whose job it is to decode the intended movements of the monkey in motor control tasks. And our tasks involve controlling cursor and virtual reality. So first I'm going to briefly describe to you the algorithm that we used. And the problem of decoding movements from neural activity can be thought of as we're searching for a mapping f between a vector of neural activity x of t to a vector of movement parameters y of t. The simplest mapping you can think of is linear regression. And when you regress instantaneous velocity against spike rates, this is equivalent to the well-known population vector algorithm, which models each neuron as a cosine function of movement direction. Now this very simple algorithm can be improved in one of two directions. The first is to add history. So since movements tend to be smooth, the movement vector is autocorrelated. And if you add a first order movement model, you get this decoder. If you also assume that the movement, the state, and the neural dynamics have Gaussian noise, this becomes the well-known Kalman filter. Now if you want to have higher order history for both the neural activity and the movement, you get the autoregressive moving average model, or ARMA. And it has an autoregression of the movement vector n time steps back and a moving average of the neural activity m time steps back. So a second way we could try to improve on this model is, obviously it's a linear model, so obviously we could add nonlinearity. And in our formulation, the way we do that is using kernels. And for those not familiar with them, they can be thought of as a similarity measure between two vectors in an often infinite feature space. So if we add a nonlinear input-output mapping, we get this decoder. So now y of t is linearly regressed against psi of x of t, where psi is a nonlinear feature map. And this is called support vector regression, or SVR for short. And if you want to have also a nonlinear movement model, now you have another term where now we have chi as a nonlinear movement model. So the algorithm that we used, we wanted to get the best of both worlds. We wanted to combine the dynamics of the ARMA model and the nonlinearity of support vector regression. So we used an algorithm called kernel autoregressive moving average, or KARMA. And it can be written for conceptual purposes as follows. So now our decoder has history of neural activity with a nonlinear input-output mapping. And it also has movement history, so state dynamics, also with a nonlinear movement model. And for those interested in the technical details of this approach, you're invited to see our NIPS 2008 paper. How does the learning algorithm look like? What it has to do, it has to minimize this error function, which is the standard support vector regression error function. It has two terms. The first is the prediction error, and the second one is a regularization term. And one of the things that we did, which makes our approach powerful, is that our learning is done both in an online and an adaptive setting, and that way the model stays current with any changes in neuronal encodings or in the quality of the recordings. Okay. So I'd first like to describe the first task that we use. Is a three-dimensional reaching task. Oh, that's very sad. Come on. Sorry about that. Microsoft haunts us forever. Yeah. So in this task, the monkey has to control the colorful ball, that's the cursor, and right now it's doing it with real arm movements that are tracked by optical sensors. The task of this, the goal of this task is very simple. It's just to move the cursor into these green targets, and if successful, the target becomes blue, there's a bell sound, and then a food reward is automatically delivered. Now the targets can appear in one of 27 locations in three-dimensional virtual space, and therefore the monkeys had to make both short and long amplitude movements to many different directions, as well as maintain a hold position between targets. And that's why this task is both more challenging and richer than the classic center-out task. It's kind of hard to see the graphics because this is filmed just with a camera facing the screen, but it looks more compelling in the virtual reality. So the first thing we wanted to do with the Karma algorithm is to test its performance in tracking real arm movements. Oh, come on. This is obnoxious. Okay. So here you can see the real arm movements made by the monkey presented by the black ball, and the predictions of the Karma algorithm presented by the blue ball. As you can see, Karma does a really good job of tracking the arm movements, and this is represented in the correlation coefficient, which is between 0.9 to 0.96 for the three different dimensions. Okay, to see this graphically, here's an 80-second segment of movement in gray, and Karma's prediction in colors for the three different dimensions. So you can see that Karma does a really good job of capturing the large movements, but sometimes during the hold period there's a small gain undershoot. Alright, so the movements are slightly smaller, and you can see that nonetheless it still captures, the algorithm captures some of the finer parts of the movement, but there's this gain undershoot, but not always. And we believe this is a result of the regularization term in our error function, which pushes to have smaller movements. Okay, so by taking the decoding perspective, we can glean insights about what aspects of neural activity help produce different characteristics of movement. The following graphs I'm going to show you, each of them is going to be the prediction of the Karma algorithm compared to the real hand movements versus the prediction of each one of its component algorithms. So here you see Karma algorithm on the y-axis, and compared to ARMA, the linear version with the same size history windows, so the comparison will be fair. Each dot represents the correlation coefficient for one data set between 25 to 35 minutes, and the three different colors are for the three different dimensions. As you can see, Karma greatly outperforms ARMA. If they had identical performance, it would obviously be on the diagonal. Now we're comparing Karma to an augmented Kalman filter. We fold into its vectors the same size history windows as Karma, and except for 4 losses, again Karma outperforms the Kalman filter, but the difference has shrunk somewhat. And finally, we compared Karma to support vector regression with the same history. Again, Karma outperforms SVR almost every time, but the difference has shrunk even more. This is what happens if we look at correlation coefficients on large time windows. If we look at the predictions themselves, you can see that both algorithms do a good job of capturing the large and ballistic aspects of the movement. However, during the hold period, support vector regression in magenta is very noisy. And that's obvious because it doesn't have a movement model. On the other hand, Karma does a really good job of capturing even some of the fine details of the movement, however, again with this gain undershoot that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so from these comparisons, we can conclude the following. From the comparison of Karma to support vector regression, this highlights to us the importance of a movement model, especially for small movements and for postural control. Conversely, you can say that the nonlinear neuronal activity captures the large and ballistic parts of the movement. And if you want in the discussion, there's more to say about this stuff if people are interested in the details. Now, by the comparison to SVR versus the comparison to the two linear models, right, the difference between these two guys to this one, this highlights the importance of a nonlinear input-output mapping and any neuronal correlations that are in the data because the kernel will capture them. And finally, the difference between the comparison of ARMA to the comparison of the Kalman filter highlights the importance of an optimal time-varying weighting of the state versus neural dynamics, the so-called Kalman gain, which is the only real difference between these two models in this implementation. Okay, so after testing the algorithm on real arm movements, it was time to try the real thing. We now restrain the monkey's second arms as well, and we let him control the cursor only with its neural activity. What you're seeing in this movie is the performance of one of the monkeys on the very first day where we let him use the BMI. And this is about 40 minutes into the first session. Please note that the movements are often fast and accurate. Now the success rate in the task for both monkeys on this very first day was about 50%. Since our task is a continuous task, that means on average acquiring each one of the targets but not maintaining the hold position for the next target. And then performance for the next following days improved, and both monkeys reached levels more or less comparable with the hand control. Okay. So both monkeys managed to control the BMI on this task that was well rehearsed on the very first day that we let them try it. The first successful trial for the first monkey was on the 9th trial, and the second, the trial is just one target presentation. And for the second monkey was on the 8th trial, which means 74 seconds and 76 seconds, respectively. Here you can see the smooth success rate for one of the monkeys as a function of trial number. Okay, so both monkeys managed to use this thing the very first time we let them do it. Now, since it's believed that learning how to control a new motor effector does not occur in tens of seconds, and since both monkeys managed to do this within tens of seconds, we believe that this shows that the monkeys are using, in some sense, a similar neural strategy for both hand and brain control. That is, the population activity must be similar in both cases. So in order to investigate this question, what we did is we had control days where we had alternating blocks of both brain control and hand control while we recorded the exact same neurons. What we're currently doing is we're analyzing the data, and we hope this approach will glean new insights about how motor cortical neurons contribute to motor control. Specifically, we want to know, do the neurons encode the same, do they have the same encoding for cursor direction in both tasks, in brain control and in motor control? Another question is for neurons that during the hand movements that they do encode either the muscles or the full arm posture, what is their role during brain-machine interface control? Okay. So the third example I'm going to give you is from a learning experiment. So sensorimotor learning has been used in the past both to look at how neural encodings change with learning, but also to try to uncover what are the relevant parameters of movement that the neurons encode. However, to date, we have not been able to see the processes underlying learning of a completely novel sensorimotor task. So in order to do that, what we did after the monkeys completed the three-dimensional task, we let them learn a novel visual motor task that they have never before seen and never before controlled with their bodies, and we let them to try to learn it directly with brain-machine interface. The task was rather simple. It was a one-dimensional cursor rotation task. Now both cursor and target were stationary in the middle of the screen. They had these orientation markings drawn on them, and the monkey had to learn to rotate the cursor around the z-axis in order to match the angle of the target. In contrast to the well-rehearsed three-dimensional task that the monkeys did in BMI instantly, this novel visual motor task was learned gradually over several days. So here you can see the success rate of one monkey as a function of the first 6 days of learning. And chance level for this task, approximate chance level, is denoted by the horizontal gray line. And you can see that for the first 3 days, it's not statistically significantly different than chance. By the 4th day it is, and by the 6th day already for this monkey, the performance was good. This is not going to work? No. So this movie shows the performance of that monkey on the 6th day. The targets are shown in blocks of 6 in order to ease learning. And you can see that the monkey still tries to turn the cursor towards the target for these 6 trials until the target switches angles to the opposite direction.
In this task, how is the monkey's virtual hand supposed to rotate this sphere?
I'm sorry?
How does the monkey's kind of virtual hand rotate this sphere?
This is purely brain control. There's no hand movements.
Okay. So
the monkey's sitting, both hands are tied. The monkey's just looking at the screen and thinking about turning the rotating the cursor.
So you don't have any initial target signal Y in this case?
No. Completely novel task. The monkey had to sit and learn, and slowly over days learn how to rotate just by thinking. Okay. So, since the monkeys managed to learn to control this novel effector, and they retain this newly learned motor skill day after day, somewhere in the brain a new controller must have been learned. So we wanted to see how the motor cortical activity, the population response, reflects the output of this new controller. So what I'm showing you here is the mean population response. Each curve is the normalized mean population response averaged over 7 days. So this is learning over 21 days for one monkey, and the standard error. So in orange, this is the mean of the first 7 days. In green, it's the mean of the next 7 days. And in blue, it's the mean of the last 7 days. Now you can see that this response has 2 phases. The first phase, which is locked to the target appearance, reflects information about the target. There's that auditory cue and the visual cue. And you can see that this response doesn't change over learning. The second phase is the movement-related activity. This is the activity. This first part is before the cursor moves at all. Okay, it's just the target appearance. The second phase is the movement-related activity, and here you can see that the population response slowly develops over the 3 weeks of learning. The peak grows and becomes slightly earlier in time. So what we're showing, and perhaps for the very first time, is how a population of M1 neurons are learning gradually to produce response patterns which are driving a completely novel sensorimotor effector. Now, one of the strengths of brain-machine interface is that this is a causal setup. We know by construction that these neurons are driving the cursor. But nonetheless, just to validate this, what I'm showing here is the mean success rate in the task as a function of the peak of the population response for these 21 days of learning. And you can see that the correlation between them is 0.75, and it's highly significant. Okay. To summarize, I've shown you 3 examples of how in the lab we're trying to use the brain-machine interface as a tool to study the sensorimotor system. First, by taking the decoding perspective, we can glean insights about what is the relative contribution of different aspects of the neural activity to produce different characteristics of movement. In the well-rehearsed three-dimensional task that the monkeys managed to do practically instantly, we're investigating how the same neurons control the exact same task using two very different effectors. Okay? On the one hand, the arm with its biomechanical properties and proprioceptive feedback, and on the other hand, the BMI algorithm, which is controlling a purely visual object. And lastly, how does the motor cortex learn to represent the output of a new controller? Slowly over learning, we are testing by letting monkeys learn novel visual motor tasks using the BMI. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hagai. Some questions? Yeah. Yes, Lenny.
That's fascinating. One question I have is, do you think motor cortex, primary motor cortex, is it all special here if you put your electrodes in posterior parietal or frontal eye fields, particularly for this third approach? Would you find a similar ability to encode, or do you think it is motor cortex specific?
So that's a great question. Nobody has done a thorough examination of moving, because these experiments are very difficult, chronic rays and so forth. So nobody's done a thorough examination of putting them in different places. For example, could we drive a motor, right? What makes this motor is because it's a continuous task, continuous control. Could we drive this task by sticking an array in, let's say, in V1, or in some more extreme example? And nobody's really done that. What people have done is they have put arrays in parietal cortex, the Richard Anderson lab, and they have managed to do classification tasks. So it's not continuous control, but a discrete task. And people have put arrays in premotor cortex as well. But exactly the fine details of how it's going to play out, nobody quite knows yet.
With your multi-electrode array, you're measuring both single-unit and multi-unit activity. Did you apply a real-time spike sorting technique to use sorted spikes and fed in your decoder?
Yeah. So we do have spike sorting. In order to drive the BMI, we feed everything we see on the array. So anything that's a spike. It can be both well-isolated, those nice units that I showed you, but also the multi-unit activity, which are detected spikes, so spike times, but they can come from many sources. And what we found interesting is that on some days, and what happens with these arrays is their quality deteriorates over months of recordings. And what we found is that on some days where you have many well-isolated units, they're not necessarily, the decoding is not necessarily better than on days where you have very few. So there is lots of information also in the multi-unit activity. And our lab even has a paper with a group in Germany that also looks at trying to decode movement direction from the LFPs. And they see which bands there also carry information.
But do you think that if you are using a spike sorting technique and take the individual spikes as representing individual neuron activities, that it would improve, say, your decoding performance?
So using the decoder that we use, we are not surprised that it isn't, because our decoder, if you take linear regression on one side, it's a linear decoder where there, the identity of the unit is very important. Since our algorithm is both a kernel machine, it's both nonlinear and a kernel machine.
Okay.
In some sense, that takes care of this problem.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So your decoder was adaptive, right? And so I wonder if you looked actually at the rates of adaptation during the task. So one question is, for example, if the monkey improves on a task, does somehow the monkey hone in on a sweet spot and your adaptation rate of the decoder goes down and it kind of finds a stable point? Second question, if the monkey has to solve a new task, is he just doing always the same and relying on the adaptation of the decoder, or is he actually doing the adaptation to actually solve the new task successfully?
Sure. So those are two different questions. On the question of adaptation, just adaptation time constants, for the well-rehearsed three-dimensional task, the algorithm, I didn't describe the details here, but the algorithm learns very fast. So the algorithm starts every day with an empty model, and it starts collecting these example vectors, and it reaches the full set of 3,000 after 3 minutes, after 150 seconds. Now, monkeys don't learn that fast. And then the adaptation continues just by the fact that we keep throwing out, as new data comes in, we keep throwing out randomly old example vectors. And I didn't show this, but I can. We did experiments where, let me see if this is it. No. Okay. So So we did experiments where we froze the learning in the middle. And these, I have to highlight, this is for monkeys that are used to working with an adaptive algorithm. And you can see here, these are these areas marked in blue. So this is, again, performance success rate in the task. And then here we freeze the algorithm, the learning algorithm, decoding continues as usual. The monkey has no idea what we've done, but he senses that something becomes difficult and he stops within 20 minutes or so, he stops working completely. We restart the learning, give it one manual reward so the monkey will try again, back to perfect performance. We do this trick again, random times, and the monkey stops. So this in some sense is telling us that at least for monkeys that are used to working with an adaptive algorithm, for example, this would be great for human subjects, there is some neural change. It could also be just recording quality, but there is neural changes that are occurring on these short time scales of minutes or maybe 20 minutes that the algorithm is tracking. So it hasn't reached a sweet spot. And then Fritz, remind me, your second question was what?
When learning a new task.
Right. All right. So the learning a new task, we know that that's monkey learning and not algorithm learning. And that I showed in this graph. So we know it's gradual learning. Because here you can see learning over days. And this is the kind of learning that, computational motor people see all the time. When you give them long, difficult tasks to learn, it takes you maybe, within the same day you have a very drawn out learning curve. It takes hundreds of trials, and in this case it's thousands of trials, right? It's several days. Okay, so this is not the algorithm, because the algorithm you can see, for example, the beginning of the day, the little bootstrapping process, you can see with these little quick transients here in the beginning of the day. That's the algorithm filling up. So that's the first 3 minutes, and then this very slow learning curve reflects the monkey's learning.
So let me clarify. In the beginning of the task, so how do you supply the target signal? So there's no actual arm movement target in the control by the brain signal, right?
In the three-dimensional task or in the one-dimensional rotation?
Both cases, right?
How do we supply the signal to the algorithm for the learning, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. That's another great question, but it's a technical one.
Yeah.
And it's addressed here. So basically what Kenji is asking is he's asking a technical question, which is when you're learning a decoder and you're comparing it to something real. For example, in the previous talk we heard you can compare it to the real images when you're reconstructing an image, and that's how you can learn. Or when we did decoding of real arm movements, we're always comparing the prediction to the real arm movements, and that's like a signal you can give the learning algorithm to learn. Yeah. In brain-machine interface, for example, with immobilized patients, they never move. That's what we need this stuff for. So how do you teach the algorithm what the subject, or in this case the monkey, wants to do? So what we do is we do a trick, a fair trick, and what we do is the following. We use our learning signal. So what you could do is you could just give it the cursor movement. But in the beginning of the day, the cursor doesn't move, so there is no movement. So what we do is we give it, let's say that the cursor movement was this blue line in 2 dimensions. And we know that the cursor started here, and we know that the target was here. Okay? So what we do is we do this time-varying weighted average, which gives actually this learning signal, the green one, to the learning algorithm. And then with time, the learning can converge actually to the target, because we assume that at the end, even though he came close to the target, he really wanted to hit the target right on the spot.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so...
Sara Sola at Northwestern University, she has shown that you can get improved decoding performance by projecting the data down to a lower dimensional manifold. So do you think, are you familiar with this work, and do you think that karma could be combined with it?
You're referring to Sara Sola's work?
Yes.
Yes. So that's really nice, but what she's doing is she's doing encoding. Okay? So it's the reverse process. There what she's doing is she's saying, what are the parameters that are relevant for one neuron? And we're doing the exact opposite. We're saying we're looking at the whole population activity, and we're trying to say, what does the animal or what does the subject want to do? That's one difference. The second difference is that there's a real big issue of real time. The initial or part of the motivation for this work is really to help immobilize patients. And when Lavie started this out, he said, I want to use kernel machines and I want to have adaptive learning. People said, no way, you can't have this work in real time. So one of the big challenges was to get this to work. And that's why we limit the set size of the example vectors to 3,000. I mean, it's still huge matrices, but we can still do the learning in real time and the decoding in real time. And part of the problem with those algorithms is that they might not be able to run in real time, and then it's hopeless for a real time application.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm curious if the monkey ever learns to perform better than real time. In other words, can it sort of teleport to the target or move faster than its hands can move?
Great, thank you. That's a great question, and I was hoping to see that happen. Okay? Now, in the well-rehearsed task, you could say, well, he's just thinking what he's thinking when he was moving his hand, maybe doing inhibition on the spinal cord, but the cortical activity is similar. That's why he's using that neural strategy. But in the novel effector, there is no reason why the monkey needs to have continuous control. And something I didn't show is that also if you look at the structure of the movement, it looks like natural movements. So they learn over time to have bell-shaped velocity profiles. And in some sense, we're like, we have these ingrained central plans about how we're going to be controlling the world. And you give it a continuous effector, and it's going to be controlling it as if it's moving a real effector, which is kind of strange because there's no reason why, our time bin here is 50 milliseconds. There's no reason why the neural activity can't change from, beginning to end in one shot. The population activity just shift, and then the cursor would just jump. And we never saw that happen, and it was very surprising. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, last question. Yeah.
You can imagine coarse motor tasks and very sort of high precision fine motor tasks. Can this approach work for the finest tasks that the animal can do?
Great. So currently the state of the art of brain-machine interface is about 4 dimensions. Okay, I showed here 3-dimensional task. Andy Schwartz's lab so far has done a robotic arm, so that's more complicated than a cursor, with a gripper. So 3 dimensions of position of the gripper, and the 4th just opening and closing. And part of the motivation for using these kind of heavy-handed algorithms is because they generalize to any number of dimensions. Okay, so the primate arm up till the hand has 7 degrees of freedom. If you look at the joint angles, and if you look at muscles, it's above 30. So, when we want to reach really anthropomorphic robotic arms to let people really control the many degrees of freedom that we have, we're going to need, then I think, the real difference between these algorithms is going to come out to play. And this one can scale to any number of dimensions. You can also add discrete dimensions, for example, if you want to have kind of categorical intentions as well as continuous ones, they can easily put into the same vector, and it scales naturally.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So,